Hello, everybody. We are really glad to see you all for the book presentation of Ian and Charles. So you've been writing a super interesting book about the process of marketization in the European Union, and I will briefly introduce you two. So let's start with Ian, who is working at Cornell University. And so you've been working on lots of sectors, including the automotive industry, and you know Europe quite well because you've spent a few months, if not a few years there, including Germany and France. And you, Charles, you've been working extensively on many sectors, including live music, but also public services. And among your particularities, Charles, you've got a bachelor in jazz studies, which I found super interesting, and which might explain why you became a specialist of live music performance and its marketization process. And both of you have been working on a European project about marketization, which is probably where your interest in this topic emerged. And so your book summarizes about 20 years of your research on different sectors, and you've been witnessing the progressive marketizations of their sectors, and you will tell us more about this process. So how this will happen, the 1 hour and a half that we'll spend together. So first, Jan and Charles will present briefly their book. Then Philippe, Valeria, and Etienne will comment. And you will have the 10 to 15 minutes back, Jan and Charles, to comment the comments. Is that right? Is that okay for you? And afterward, we'll have 30 minutes to have Q&As with the audience. So if everybody's fine with that, we'll give the floor to Jan and Charles to introduce their book.
All right. Well, thank you, Vincent. It's really nice to be here talking to the CRIMT crowd. Is my screen sharing working?
It is.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to attempt just a 10-minute summary of what is going on in this book to get things started. So this book is about Europe, and it's about marketization processes. I'm based in the United States, and so there's obviously this question, well, what do we have to say to people in North America? And it's something that I kind of fret about a lot, because especially here in the United States, it's kind of hard to talk with them about what is happening in other countries. They're mostly interested in their own country. And so I tell them, well, it's about this idea that elites in Europe, especially the European Commission, had, that you could solve the world's problems through more competition. And the book talks about what the effects of that were, which were not really the intended consequences, certainly not good consequences for workers. And a couple of times I've heard Americans say to me when I give them that sort of elevator pitch, oh, well, that would never happen here. So I guess it is relevant, and hopefully at the end we can talk a little bit more about what this has to say to debates in the United States and Canada. Before I really get into it, I just want to talk about the concept of marketization that we use. So it's really about intensified competition at the level of the transaction. And this can be done by governments, for example, in public services, when they try to re-engineer public services through more competition, but businesses also do it, for example, through their outsourcing practices or by creating online platforms. And there are three main things that they do at the level of the transaction that lead to more competition. One is they make sure that the things on offer are more comparable in terms of price and quality. They make it easier for outsiders to enter the market. and they also increase the frequency of transactions. So instead of having very long contracts, you might have 1-year contracts, or you might even have ongoing transactions. The thing about it, as said, is it doesn't always work very well. It certainly can be expensive. It is often bureaucratic, and there's a lot of fiddliness in it. And I think probably the place I have learned the most about all of this is the European Union, because there's immense amount of work that goes into making markets, especially in the European Commission, DGs in Brussels. I'm glad Philippe is here, because I just think that is a fascinating place if you want to understand the reality of how market competition can be intensified. I mean, in the past, it was kind of hard to talk with academics about this, because according to many schools of thought, marketization is unlikely. Certainly, the place where I first started looking at it, Germany, it was considered unlikely because most people who study Germany believe in varieties of capitalism. Varieties of capitalism says it's a coordinated market economy. It's not a liberal market economy. Market mechanisms are dominant in liberal market economies and not coordinated market economies. But I mean, even outside of comparative political economy, the most Polanyians, followers, especially in sociology, of Karl Polanyi, say, well, you know, there are counter movements. That yes, there's marketization, but you shouldn't be so pessimistic, Ian and Charles, because they will be rolled back by social movements. And even in Marxism, there's a lot of reasons to believe that marketization isn't that important in capitalism. I mean, Rudolf Hilferding is a super important figure for us because he's probably the seminal thinker in Marxism about how markets work, especially finance. And Hilferding, back in the early 20th century, wrote a lot about how capitalists were suppressing competition. So, you know, this is the basic terrain that we are working on. And our argument is that you can observe marketization in really a lot of contexts, especially in the time we were studying since the 1990s in this place, Europe, under conditions of capitalism. It's pervasive, and academic theories have very slowly come to accept that. However, when you get into it, when you really understand how these marketization initiatives work, they're expensive, they're brittle, and often disappointing to the people who are trying to push them. And so the question is, it's kind of a puzzle, you know, despite all these problems, why do they bother to marketize? And so we argue that marketization is best understood via its connection to class discipline. This helps to explain not only why it is sustained, but also why its outcomes are so often skewed against workers and towards capital. And we also, I mean, another important point is that marketization also involves the creation of new rules and processes that are sealed off from democratic oversight. So there's a lot of what Culpeper calls quiet politics, and this is quite deliberate. So, you know, we did lots of research studies over many years, and we studied, in this book, we talk about healthcare, employment services, and live music. And we kind of looked at them in as gory detail as possible. I think many people believe that they know what marketization is without ever having looked at it, but actually it's probably even less pretty than you imagine it once you really look at it, warts and all. And I mean, most of the book draws on a big European funded project we did looking at cases in the UK, France, Slovenia, Greece, and Finland, which were conducted between 2012 and 2016, as well as other research that that we did in Germany. And the approach to it is very empirical and very qualitative. And I apologize if we go too far into the weeds and it gets a little boring or technical, but I feel we both, Charles and I and the team, feel that that is really important in order to do to do justice to the phenomenon and really show people how it works, how competition can be intensified, and also what the effects are. So what do we mean when we talk about marketization as class discipline? What we mean is that there are a lot of different ways where intensified competition makes it constrains the agency of workers, shaping the terms and conditions of their work. It does so by making them more insecure and by increasing new targets and criteria, also making workers more interchangeable with one another, and expanding the industrial reserve army of competition in the labor market, which tends to squeeze wages. How can we say that marketization, that class discipline is the purpose of marketization? Well, I mean, there are other reasons to marketize too, so it's a simplification, but often disciplining workers is a stated goal. Certainly in public services, quasi-markets theory is about that, where, yeah, public services should be re-engineered using competition orchestrated by state. There are many other examples we could name of this. And also at the level of incentives, disciplining workers is important for labor, for the state, and for capitalists. I am running out of time. I just want to point out that our conceptualization of the exchange process kind of started off institutionalist with John Commons and Williamson, and then we realized that they were scooped quite a few decades previously by Marx in Capital Volume 2. So, you know, if you want to learn about our conceptualization and kind of the theoretical tradition of understanding exchanges and competition, yeah, it's in the book. Our notion of the state is really inspired by Marxist state theory, and there are really important kind of modifications to it to understand financialization and how states respond to that, and how kind of despite the uncertainty and dysfunction of intensified competition, especially in financial markets, how business confidence becomes a kind of workaround. So that's kind of, if you want to know more about that, it's in the book, also in a paper that Charles led with members of the research team. I just want to conclude by talking about what the alternatives are, because this is, we were kind of, everyone who commented on the book wanted to know more about that. I mean, it's a pretty minimalist program of action that we propose. There are a lot of kind of unplanned things that we observed that are really under the radar. A lot of public pushback from unions and users of services, other people in the community. Also, I mean, for us, what was really interesting were cases where localities and professionals had the power to control the market in which they're operating, or even the sector they're in, preventing it from being marketized at all. We wrote some really, probably the most interesting case of this was in the Parisian suburbs in Seine-Saint-Denis. So, you know, like, I think what we're calling for is to take these things that are in quiet politics and favor business because they're so lacking in democratic public scrutiny, and to make them noisy and really contest them and disrupt market-making processes. So that's the book, and I really look forward to comments from the other participants.
Thank you very much, Ian, for giving us the taste of the book for those who haven't been reading it yet. So now it's time for our three commenters. We could hardly gather a more qualified panel of commentators to comment your book. So we've got Philippe, Valeria, and Étienne. And maybe if we've got two options now. Either we ask you to prepare three questions. Maybe we could go question by question. So the first one was the main takeaways, and then I would give you 2 minutes to summarize your main takeaways, and then we would follow up with a second round of questions. Does that work for you, Philippe, Valeria, and Étienne? Or do you prefer to have your 10-minute speech in one shot?
It's okay. Otherwise,
up to you. That's as you know.
Okay, then we'll go question by question. So you've got 2 minutes to begin with. 2 minutes to summarize your main takeaway of the book, and we will start with Philippe.
Okay, first I have to say that I like very much the book. It's very sophisticated, and when we have question why they don't address some of the point, 2-page. Later, you have the debate. That's really a kind of mix of political economy, political science, and sociology. So I think that's really, I learned a lot, and I hope that at the end I will receive the real book, because here I have all the paper with my notes, but would be really nice that they arrive one day. But I think there is two, I think what I like from that is the first, the kind of, there is two tension. I think there is the first tension is, as you said, Ian, this kind of the attempt to terrorize the beast. And I think it's also part of the theory of state that you return to with marketization. And on the other side, to take what is the reality on the ground and to have a much more sociological approach to the kind of decrypt what is happening on the ground. And certainly, I just confirm what you said about the French model in the when they can reinterpret the norm of the central power when they have good team able to do that, and that you enter really in sociology. So I like really this kind of tension in the book. It's two part, but I think it's from the beginning there is a interesting story that you take for your long research. The second one, that tension, I think, and I will return to that in the second intervention, is the tension between, you say, okay, there is a direction, there is kind of the forest, don't take the tree, take the forest. But at the same time, when you read your case, there is a lot of subtlety and there is a lot of difference at the end. So there is a tension to say, okay, don't miss the big story or the big narrative, but in the same time, look how different in a way there is the story are between the sector, but between the countries too. So that's for my 2 minutes, I think I've already used perhaps 3. So that's my first intervention.
Thank you very much, Philippe. So it's a good combination of like high-level theorization and really deep qualitative investigation. So what's your stake on that, Valeria?
Yes, thank you very much. Also from my side, congratulations to Ian and Charles. I think it's a fantastic book. It's really so inspiring reading it, and also very accessible, which is not something that is given for granted. So it's a very, very nice, readable kind of book. And yeah, I mean, I also have some takeaway. I mean, to me, as Philippe mentioned, this sociological vein, I would translate it into a kind of critical, reflexive vein, which I find it quite important and interesting. And I find particularly important the fact that the books invite these political economy and employment and industrial relations scholars also to reflect more carefully about the social construction of the markets and the politics, of course, which underline this process of market construction as a socially constructed entity. I think that, well, Ian pointed to the work of Polanyi as one of the main authors inspiring the kind of theoretical construction of the book. And following the kind of pattern, we do know that the way in which we have been as industrial relation scholars looking at these, kind of market sort of things is in fact through this idea of the disembeddedness of the social action from market-based mechanisms. Now, I do think that the book here builds on much more, because in fact, paid attention on how social actors can create this kind of markets and enable them to work or to fail. So this politics of market creation for me is very important, the role of the state. Another important takeaway is the focus on these economic transactions, which I find it quite important as well. And which can be manufactured in such a way, in fact, as explained in the book, to boost competition and put pressure on workers. And we see these happening extremely hard. So that is also something that I appreciated very much in the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Étienne?
Yes. My turn. I hope it will not be seen as conventional or unoriginal on my part, but my main takeaway is actually the author's central theoretical argument, which is stated on page 26. Marketization, as it played out in 21st century Europe, is best understood as a tool for imposing class discipline. I think that's really the key point that differs this work from earlier works by Baccaro and Orwell or Wolfgang Streich. So I'll formulate a couple of constructive criticisms of the book in the next segments, but I really want to echo this neo-Marxist or indeed neo-Kaleshkin argument to the effect that in the context of financialization and the dysfunctional accumulation regime, there's been increased importance of class discipline, in European policy making. And the book really shows that in great details for different sectors. So marketization is really a story about capitalists and states managing the exchange process, not only to the end of profit making and securing a return, but also undermining democratic institutions in the process. And I think that's really an important point. So the authors really very well demonstrate the class dynamics that have driven marketization in the first part. I have some qualms with different bits of the argument, but overall it's a very convincing argument. And they really show that marketization increases power disparity between workers and capital, and class discipline as a general argument comes out of that very strongly. And then in part two, we see shifting power relations in different sectors. I was on strike, so I didn't get to the last chapter, but the healthcare and employment services chapters were really strong. And really display the different manners in which class discipline has been instilled in the process. So, and there for now, and go to the constructive criticisms later on.
So thank you very much. So if I may summarize, you're praising the really high level of theorization of the book, including notably the fact that the concept of class discipline is really well framed and really well conceptualized. Valeria also underlined the really nice way that you theorize that markets are not natural things and they are socially created by politicians and accepted by society. And Philippe also recalled that the empirical part is part of the obvious richness of the book. So the second question bears more on the three topics, themes that you would like to discuss more in depth. That might be that might give place to debates, and to discuss the three main themes that you want to underline. Maybe we'll start this time with Valeria and then go to Étienne and last with Philippe, if that works for you.
Yeah, it's fine. Thank you, Vincent. So about these observations, well, I would like to start from where I ended, which was this issue and the focus on the economic transactions and the way in which these can be reorganized by the actors, which mainly are capital and governments, and which disempower workers in these different ways. Now, I found this kind of focus quite important in the sense that, in fact, it advances understanding about the conditions under which a certain type of marketization is implemented and can discipline, in fact, workers. Here, the state and the capital structure seems to be key to understand the creation of the market, which produces this discipline effect on workers. Now, this is very important, I think, but I have also a kind of question here in the sense of observation. I wonder whether, we could think also in terms of what are the legitimizing and ideological logics which, through which this continuous disciplining of workers operates, and if they are, where can we, kind of concretize and objectively, study them, and also is that disciplining implies acceptance by workers. Now, Ian presented the very end, and there is, in fact, a possibility to think in terms of how workers, how the working class is trying to, regain power. But what can we say more? So what kind of, possibilities there are for workers to resist that power, and particularly more than power and more than resistance, I would talk about resilience. So how those workers sometimes, also try to kind of cope with this kind of situation, and where do they get the resources, if they get any kind of resources to cope with this situation, and particularly how these state policies that are very much underlined in the book, in the light of these marketization processes, how do they, how do they interact, how do they articulate with this kind of resources and access to resources by workers. My second observation goes on the claim that marketization is a tool, in fact, as I said, of class discipline. I would like to say that I really praise, as has been said also before, the use of class. I think we should really engage much more in using this concept more and more. And here, so I see that the focus in the book, in fact, goes on this process of power forces, capital and labor, which presupposes a reduction of bargaining power from the labor side by increasing price-based competition from a capital kind of side. Now, I fully agree with all these kind of claims. I wonder whether more nuances could be thought, perhaps, or could exist in realities, in the sense that, to what extent, now the three areas of work, so the employment services, healthcare, and the live music are very important sectors, but I just wonder whether, there is a possibility to find similarities of this kind of logic, which are described in these three sectors also outside. For example, how would work in a kind of traditional manufacturing kind of sector, in a traditional industry-based context? So I would like to say that perhaps we could think about the conditions under which also here labor can, in these also outside service realities, regain power. Are those capacities again similar to the one that we see in the other area? And finally, a last observation is, now I really very much like the argument and the theoretical underpinning of the argument, but I just wonder why a theory of marketization? Marketization truly matters, but why really a theory? Why do we need a theory of marketization, if at all, in the sense of how studying marketization helps us understanding, again, the functioning of other, not only service-based sectors and the implications of those. So these are my main three observations.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Étienne?
Yes, I find first point that this is a very well-crafted example of comparative qualitative analysis, and it brings an important contribution to various debates. I find marketization is really well defined in this work. It's really, as Ian has pointed it, the real world mechanisms through which the process of exchange is reorganized by governments and businesses, and that successfully created and intensify market exchange. So it's a much more focused analysis here than we have in typical Polanyian analysis, or broader analysis in terms of decommodification and recommodification of labor. And I'd like to get back to this concepts in a wee bit. The authors follow a trend in comparative political economy of welfare and work that increasingly focuses on how institutions are subverted, deconstructed, undermined to facilitate marketization. And it's a welcome trend after debates that were increasingly sterile about varieties of capitalism. So other authors such as Wolfgang Streich or Baccaro and Howell also participate in this trend. This book is different. Greer and Umney say that discussions of neoliberalism and liberalization, they offer an evocative depiction of epochal shifts in capitalist society, but they're more interested in the concrete functioning of price competition than in these grand narratives of institutional change. That said, in the theoretical part of the book, you do engage in some outlining of a grand narrative of your own, if I may say. It's present in the discussion of state theory, among other things. I'll come back to that. A point that I would make is that you could maybe have better highlighted the value of your political economy of marketization by contrasting it with discussions of the multidimensional decommodification of labor, be it from the Frankfurt School of Sociology with Klaus Hofer or Gustav Esping Andersen. And there is a concept of decommodification that was developed first on a napkin at the University of Wisconsin, and the artwork was shared between Hofer and Esping Andersen. I know you've mentioned this tradition or line of work in other papers, but it might have reinforced your point to contrast your concepts of your concept of marketization with the concept of decommodification and recommodification of labor. That was really initially a way to develop that derived from Polanyi, but also was meant to more specifically highlight the way welfare states weaken the cash nexus by granting entitlements and therefore limit the wage dependency of workers. And it was also a way to specify T.H. Marshall's notion of social citizenship rights, pardon me. And I think these were important contributions, and maybe you could contrast today your concept of marketization with this broader tradition. You have used, instead of these works in comparative political economy, Poulantzas's theory to the effect that the state should be viewed as a specific material condensation of given relationship of forces, especially in his last book. On this basis, you develop a theory of the rising class power of labor in the 50s and 60s as the basis for a sort of social compromise or social compact in European welfare states. So the theorization of the post-war system there is interesting. Another author that could have been brought forward is maybe Michal Keleshki, and I think you've also referred to his work elsewhere. But basically Keleshki during World War II explained that rising class power in the form of full employment, strong unions, etc., could be very worrying from the point of view of capital, and we could expect ways or strategies to undermine it later on. And it's true, like when the golden age ended in the 70s, rising unemployment undermined labor's bargaining power in collective bargaining, informally on the shop floor. The fear of the sack became more and more potent. And what you explain well is our marketization increases this fear of the sack and insecurity on the part of labor. So you really show well our marketization has been an important means of instilling class discipline across Europe. And I salute you. What I'd like maybe you to do is contrast it with the Kaleshkian point of view, or the decommodification, recommodification theorization. And I'll end there for now.
Thank you very much, Étienne. So, Philippe, what's your main topic for discussions?
Yeah, as in my first intervention, I spoke about tension. I will keep the idea of tension, and I suggest three tensions that could be developed. The first one, as was said, I think marketization is very well defined, and that helps to see what is what you mean by marketization, and also there is kind of tension between controlling the market and marketization. But my point is also you refer that in your interview very often the employer side, let's say the manager, were not convinced at all by what they were doing, and that thing I think that would be interesting. They go a little bit further then, because if the people that are supposed to be the kind of support of the capital in the daily life are not convinced, that's an interesting tension. That's clear that they continue, but they are not part of the system or part of the book. You say very often they were thinking that marketization is not working very well, and a lot of bureaucracy for a little result at the end, if I understood. So I think that would be interesting to have a little bit more why this group of actors is continuing first the process, because they are not directly or not necessarily directly in the first line to discipline the workers. The second one is to use Poulantzas, that I like that Poulantzas is returning to in several books as an important author. And I think also because there is part of Poulantzas that you mentioned as the state as the kind of that's tension between the society, but there is also part of the Poulantzas and certainly the book about Greece, about the tension between these different fractions of capital, national and international. So I think Poulantzas, and I'm wondering why you simplify so much at one point, and there is no tension in the capitalist class. It's just the kind of working class, and there is no tension within the working class. And you have capitalists against workers, which I think perhaps is easier to understand, but perhaps too simple. And certainly with Poulantzas, the contradiction and the different tension between the dynamic between the capitalists. You explain a little bit with financialization, but I'm not fully convinced. And thirdly is the political side of that. And I like very much page in the printed version 122. There is the case of Hamburg, which is fascinating. When you explain how they resist in the city, they try to resist. And you have at the same time, and that's the sentence, you say that the 3/4 of the electorate vote to block privatization, but in the same time, the conservative in the same day or the same year increase the share of the vote in the same election. And I think that's rather fascinating because once again, it's showing a tension. You are explaining a case that there is organization, but the people seem to have two planets. So one, they support, they are against privatization, and then they vote for the local government, regional government in this case, that support privatization. So once again, perhaps what was a little bit missing in kind of more general, not the case, but the more theoretical approach was the tension and internal contradiction that you didn't mention so much. So.
Thank you very much for this, Philippe. So many themes appear from these comments. First one, maybe where you could elaborate about where does it fit exactly, as Valeria asked, why do we need such a theory of marketization? And maybe you could engage in your answers in how could you create a dialogue with other theorization similar to yours, for instance, the one mentioned by Étienne about the decommodification. And it raises also other questions about how generalizable is it, because it's true that you've been focusing mainly on service industries, not on heavy industries, for instance, or manufacturing sectors. So this also raises the question of how could your theorization of marketization could expand to other sectors. And the very last comment of Philippe that I find really intriguing is that if it's not efficient, why do we keep on doing that? That's also a question that triggers my interest, and you will have more time maybe to elaborate. But before that, we'll have our third round of questions, and we'll start this time with Étienne. And the last question, and you'll have 2 minutes, the three of you, to summarize what should be going next as regards to this research. Where should we be looking for, and what does it inspire you, Étienne?
I would have expected that we'd leave them a bit of time to answer, but let's add another here. The book really shows well how marketization disempowers workers and threatens their pay and security, but on top of it, weakens institutions that might help workers get a better deal. And I think that's really clear in the book. Other works have discussed this in terms of, for Western Europe, in terms of a new labor regime of informality and precarity. I think of the work of Jan Breman and Marcel van der Linden in the last few years. And they described this new regime with the following stylized facts. Basically, first, weakening of trade unions and workers' bargaining power, influenced by decreasing generosity of the welfare state. Then you have a steep fall in the wage share that's been well studied by post-Keynesian economists such as Stockhammer. You have increased outsourcing and subcontracting, a third point. Fourth would be replacement of permanent and full-time employment by casualized part-time jobs. And then fifth would be substitution of waged work by self-employment. And then a last one, maybe drastic cutbacks on secondary benefits that affect social protection, social security, and the rise of workfarist policies. So all that is well dealt with in the book in some ways, although it's not necessarily ordered in this way. I forgot one. We have a relaxation of control by official agencies on compliance with legally prescribed terms of employment and conditions of work. So l'inspectorat du travail is weakened. One question I have is really marketization the key process that explains these multiple manifestations of growing precarity and informalization? Or do we need as well a concept at a higher level of abstractions, such as a new stage of capitalism that would be characterized also by globalization, financialization, neoliberal reconfiguration of the state? So in terms of levels of abstraction, I'm wondering where marketization fits with these broader concepts. I think it's more specific. I think one of your claim or central proposition is that marketization drives economic and social inequality in the way it affects non-market institutions. and then disparate changes in institutional regulation at the level of work, markets, welfare state are explained by that process of marketization. It's convincing the way you put it, but I wonder if we could also have agreement on broader processes. In your book, you say financialization push states to adopt policies that lead to marketization as a process. So there seems to be a line of argument here that puts financialization as a broader process or prior process. Otherwise, I think it's a very rich book. The first part, and I'm ending soon here. I see a lot of potential for cross-fertilization with not only Hilferding and Marxist theory, but also post-Keynesian theories of the firm under financialization, Stockhammer's work on uncertainty, class and power, etc. And I think in terms of research challenges, I think your theory of marketization could be applied to financial firms to study the way they enrich top employees, destroy shareholder value, create systemic financial instability, and in the process push governments towards detrimental policies for the population in general. So I think in terms of sectors, you might envisage to study, that could be the financial sector per se. Take not Goldman Sachs because they're based in the US, but maybe Deutsche Bank or something like that. That would be interesting to test your concepts on a financial firm, I think.
Thank you very much, Étienne. Philippe, so for you, what could be the coming avenues based on this book?
Yeah, I will speak about a little bit about the French authors and do a nice provocation for you. That's kind of, and I think that's the when I read that, I think that if you remember, there was the debate in political science in France in the 80s and 90s with Pierre Muller, who has fed up to have the state as a unitary state and want to develop the idea of how we can analyze public policy and see the diversity of the sector, but keeping in the same time this kind of some kind of coherence between the different sector and the different actors. And I think your book would fit very well with this kind of line of those post-Marxists, because they were fed up by the Marxists, so that they will not quote your volume 2 of Marx. But they have a lot of stuff that with this, I don't know if you noted this work because it was mainly in French, but the kind of global referential and sectoral referential was really important. The image of the sector, you very often, for the musician and for the health sector, you say the image how the people project themselves. And I think with that, you can have kind of much more unity and diversity is better integrated than just by having capitalists and workers. So that's a kind of suggestion to go to see what the post-Marxists is, or the people that use that could offer us avenue for thinking. And that's with that my 2 minutes. I'm very sorry because in 5 minutes is the selection of the next general director. So for my position, so I have to leave the debate. So I will not have directly your question, but as I saw it's recorded, sorry, I will see that I will later, I will watch to your answer. Sorry for that, but that's life. Okay, but thank you. That's really a very, very good book.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for your participation, and good luck with the recruitment process. And it was really nice to have you. And now, Valeria, what do you think should be the next avenues, and what are the avenues opened by the book, according to you?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'll be very short and probably also kind of picking up what I've said before. I think this book really raises a lot. Well, it gives a lot of answers, important answers, but also raises a lot of questions. And one of the questions, as I said before, triggers me is to really look into these kind of how, legitimacy and ideology plays, if any, a role in these processes of marketization disciplining. It would be interesting, to me to kind of articulate between these two kind of levels, which is more the kind of structural sort of side with a more, I would say, processes cultural side, something very sometimes not difficult to be done, but challenging. Yeah, I think would be really interesting. And on the other side, as I said before, certainly the kind of need perhaps to look at the applicability of this theory to other sectors and industries to kind of give really this theory a big arena where it can apply. And perhaps what I would also say is, if I think in terms of the state as actor of marketization and the implications that this creates, I was thinking from a comparative industrial relations and employment relations side. Ian also mentioned at the very beginning these varieties of capitalism approach. Now, it seems to me that here we are, in fact, on something completely different. And it would be interesting to kind of translate this theory of marketization in a kind of tool that comparative political economy, industrial relations scholars could use more systematically. Now, I'm not thinking, in terms of reproducing something on the varieties of capitalism, but, thinking in terms of how can we make sense more systematically, providing a kind of tool set that comparative scholars could use for their own research on these aspects. That would be really fascinating, at least to me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Valeria, Étienne, and Philippe. So the two of them raised many questions. I guess you've got enough questions to start thinking of this volume 2 of Marketization, but unfortunately you only have 10 minutes to answer the main points. So before we would open the floor to the audience. So who wants to go first, Ian or Charles?
I nominate Charles to go first.
All right. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, and thank you, Philippe, Valeria, and Étienne. It's really amazing to have people kind of scrutinize and think about and comment on what we've done in this much depth. So I'm really sort of excited to be here and really appreciate the work you've put in and the comments you've given. I think I'm going to go through some of the questions, and there probably won't be all of them because obviously it's quite a lot of questions. So maybe Ian can pick up ones I've missed. I've sort of gone through the ones I think I have an answer for, basically. So firstly, actually, I think Valeria asked earlier on, there's this question of how do workers cope with what's going on? How do workers sort of respond to marketization? And I think we do have something to say here. I mean, part of the book is looking at sort of workers within kind of bureaucratic structures. And we find very often that they tend to behave in ways that are not particularly consistent with what the kind of rules of marketization processes would say. So I think what's interesting is in those cases, the way they cope is by finding ways to allocate resources in ways that they think are appropriate rather than ways that are dictated by sort of rules of marketization. And that's probably something that's not particularly well studied in a lot of the literature at the moment, that kind of sort of bureaucratic and administrative maneuvering that a lot of workers, for instance, in public services do. The other thing here is more strategically, what can and should trade unions be doing about this stuff, for instance. I think the key there is what Ian had sort of talked about in terms of quiet versus noisy politics. So we think that marketization, in many cases, can be quite a brittle process, which is kind of apt. It's very complicated. It's often sort of vulnerable to being derailed or going wrong. And one of the ways we observe that it often goes wrong is when either workers, unions, or even campaigners, like service user groups and things, for example, in welfare to work, are able to make things which are being kept quiet and make them loud So, okay, where people are able to say, this is how the rules of the market work here. But actually, if you really study, if you study this set of rules, it can lead to these outcomes, and make that sort of quiet logic into something loud that people can see and understand. And that's where you get scrutiny and resistance. And often marketization processes are not well adapted to respond to that, and they can be quite brittle. You know, if you have sort of a process whereby you create a sort of bureaucratic institution for privatizing hospital services, often the reason they can do that is because people don't really know what's going on. And if you say, look, this is what's happening, then actually those initiatives often tend to break down. Étienne's comment about grand narratives, yeah, I hope we successfully avoid too much kind of grand narrative building. The section on state theory, I would like to think of as relatively sort of historically situated. So we, for instance, we have a story about how kind of financialization, for instance, has greatly heightened the extent to which class discipline is an imperative for states. So we sort of present this kind of push towards class discipline as partly exacerbated by kind of the dynamics of financialization. So for me, yeah, you're right. And I really appreciate you saying we kind of avoid this kind of grand narrativizing. And the idea with that discussion of state theory is to show that, okay, Marxist state theory has a long sort of established set of ideas about why the state tends to act in capital's interests. But what we're trying to do is to show sort of concretely at this particular point in time, why does that take the form it does? And we try and sort of situate that historically rather than as a sort of general rule. Philippe's point about, in some cases, being perhaps a bit too blunt, sort of talking in very general terms about sort of capital versus labor. And of course, we also refer to people like Poulan-Sas, where actually, you know, there's a more nuanced picture of kind of class fractions, divisions between sort of capital and labor. And yeah, this is absolutely true and fair enough. I think our sort of defense of that then is that we're essentially talking about a dynamic, you know, where we have marketization processes of intensifying, creating, extending market competition, we are likely to see shifts in the balance of power between people who sell their labor power in exchange for a wage and people who profit off that labor power. Now, of course, we recognize that in different contexts, the ways in which that plays out are going to be very different. But yeah, we're trying to isolate this dynamic, and perhaps it's sort of for other people or for future research to kind of work out the different sort of fractions involved in that. How generalizable do we think it is? I mean, Ian will probably say more here. I think it's reasonably generalizable. You know, we talked about sort of manufacturing, heavy industry. Ian will have a lot to say here. But if we look at manufacturing, dynamics of intensifying competition between groups of workers through things like outsourcing are a really pronounced and important sort of part of the history of kind of manufacturing industries. So I would like and hope to think that it is reasonably generalizable. My sort of current project I'm spending most of my time on now is looking at the warehousing industry. And I haven't quite worked out the best way to apply these ideas to that at the moment because we're at a very early stage. But it would certainly be really interesting for me to see if within warehousing, whether we start to see these dynamics applying in the same way. So that's kind of an interesting question for me as well, which I might know the answer to in a couple of years. And finally, there was the really interesting final question from Valeria. Could this translate into a sort of framework for comparative industrial relations in the future? The answer is yes, it absolutely does. And you must use that framework and cite it. Quite exactly how, I'm not sure. It might be that Ian knows the answer to this. So I'll hand over to you, Ian.
All right. Let me just repeat Charles's point about just how awesome it is that you all read our book and spent time thinking about it and giving great comments and asking really good questions. I mean, like, I don't know, this is why I wanted to do it, because the dominant framework of comparative employment relations was just causing problems for me, and I felt like we needed something else. Otherwise, I would have no tools to explain what I was seeing, especially in Germany. What happens if you're a varieties of capitalism theorist and you see privatization in Germany is you just focus on all the institutions that prevent it from harming workers, and you focus on all these, well, it distracts you from the really important thing, which is, in this case, privatization in Germany. The purpose is to rationalize, economize, speed up work, find ways to get workers to do more without costing more money. This kind of thinking is very intuitive if you come out of the labor movement like I do. I worked for American unions before I was an academic. If you're an academic comparative political economist, you studying Germany, you don't necessarily think of this. So I'm hoping that we provide some sensitizing concepts for understanding things that are considered unlikely by the dominant theories. I think the conceptualization of competition at the level of the transaction is actually very closely aligned to classic institutional economics, but also Marxism. Why we need it. Why we need a theory of marketization. So it's because if we don't have it, then it's very hard as researchers to understand what is going on when marketization is taking place. Because most other theories of this don't necessarily sensitize you to what is going on. There's also like a question of, well, what do you do when you see it? Like, should you just assume that your collective bargaining system or your welfare state is going to protect the workers? I think that's what German academics were thinking at the time when I was studying all these things, all these marketization phenomena that were causing problems for unions and workers. And in this case, that intensified competition actually disrupted those institutions. And so, I mean, in a way, it should make us a little bit less quiescent or complacent when it comes to our institutions and how we think they're going to protect people from, when there are changes in markets. There's a question about decommodification from Étienne, and in a way, you could see marketization as the opposite of decommodification. But I mean, the thing about Esping Anderson is that for him, the market is just like kind of this residual thing. And so when he says that welfare is handled by the market in liberal welfare regimes, he doesn't actually talk about for-profit hospital chains or the competitive tendering in welfare services. He's thinking of the market in a much more abstract kind of way. And so, I mean, the big difference here is that we have kind of a concrete way to look at markets in competition to understand how they differ from one another and how they actually work. I mean, I've used the concept of recommodification before, and it is a thing, obviously this is an intention in labor market reform to take people who are outside of the labor market and push them back into the labor market so that the labor market will be more dynamic. And this is supposed to improve things for the working class and reduce poverty. But, you know, it also puts pressure on workers at the bottom of the labor market. And I think all the economic empirical literature on it confirms what I just said. So, you know, it's like the Esping-Andersen stuff is super important for especially the labor market part of what we're talking about. But there was also this frustration that the team had, or at least that I had, with Esping-Andersen, how it dealt with the market. I just want to say one more thing about generalizability. Actually, this thing that made me want to study marketization was not healthcare or live music or active labor market schemes. It was aircraft manufacturing and the auto industry, because there was offshoring and outsourcing and clear market making by Boeing and Volkswagen and General Motors and Ford. And I was in Airbus, and I was trying to figure out how you would study that. And I realized that these for-profit companies would never give me access to really understand it in their sector. And so I've found some nice sectors where you could study it because they're public sector, and therefore, you know, there's more publicly available information. So, you know, like members of the team, and I guess other people, are probably going to use these ideas to look at more sectors. I mean, I kind of have to use them at the moment to understand the EV transition, because so much of it is promoted by these government funding streams, especially in the United States, but also in Europe. So understanding, like, they're trying to create incentives, and they're trying to they're trying to get the market to expand, and get private companies to do what they want. And it's totally unclear if that will work, but understanding how markets function is really important, I think, for understanding what's going to happen with the green transition manufacturing that governments are trying to promote. So once again, many thanks. I look forward to more questions.
Thank you very much for your detailed reflections. So now it's time to open the floor. I'm going to let you speak, all of you. So you just will have to open the mic if you like to ask a question. So if it's the case, please don't hesitate. Open your mic and ask questions to our authors. So it seems that we so far have a relatively shy audience. So maybe I will go first for first question, and it's about workers' reaction. And it seems that we are currently facing a significant wave of strike in the UK, but not as big in the rest of Europe. And I was wondering whether degrees of marketization or other dynamics might explain current waves of protests in Europe.
That's a really interesting question. Thank you. Yeah, the UK is witnessing a kind of significant uptick in levels of strike activity after having been at kind of historically low levels for decades, although it's not yet at the level it was in the late 1970s, for instance. To what extent is that to do with the relatively higher levels of marketization in the UK? I mean, to some extent, it's to do with the intensity of inflation. Now, there's probably a wider argument there about to what extent sort of abnormally high rates of inflation in the UK related to marketization. You know, if we look at what's going on in the kind of energy industry, which is a big driver of inflation, the UK does have a very marketized energy industry where things like kind of state capacity, state sort of pricing and supply strategy have been hollowed out. And that may be part of the reason why inflation is so much worse in the UK, which then partly explains why strike activity has been so much higher in the UK as well. If we take my own experience in higher education, which has, we've had a very prolonged and quite intense several years of strike action on and off in higher education in the UK, yes, that is a direct consequence of marketisation. I mean, in UK debates, if you start talking about marketisation, higher education is very often the first thing people jump to, because it has been such a kind of complete and textbook example of what it would mean to marketise a sector through imposition of competition across kind of every conceivable level. And whatever the sort of very immediate proximate causes of problems in the sector, absolutely, that's completely inescapable, and that's a huge part of the reason why we have such conflictual industrial relations in UK higher education. Yeah, so I don't know, that's kind of a parochial UK-centric answer. I don't know if you want to add anything, Ian.
So in Germany, there has been in healthcare a lot of strike action lately, and also government action to roll back the market. So Philippe mentioned the case of Hamburg, where they privatized a huge hospital chain in a big city. They shifted it from public sector ownership to a for-profit corporation about 20 years ago. And this is such a classic example of something that starts as quiet politics, the details of pricing of health services in Germany's social insurance funded health system, that then creates financial pressures, and governments start then privatizing. That leads to noisy politics around privatization, but by then it's kind of too late. It was in the hands of this very stable government that was able to get reelected. And now 20 years later, the government is rolling back that market in the face of labor shortages in the health sector, high turnover of nurses, and now strikes. Yeah, this is one thing that the public sector has done, or that the public funder has done, is reduce kind of the importance of DRG funding for services, so that the health insurance covers the cost of health provision and doesn't create incentives for squeezing workers' pay. So, it's like there was a lot of kind of anger and discontent that built up because of the constraints of this marketized system, and now it's getting rolled back to some extent. There hasn't been a lot of privatization recently. So, there's kind of a complex two-sided relationship between industrial action and marketization, but they definitely are related. Gregor's hand is up.
We've got Gregor's hand, but we've got also two other written questions. Somebody who preferred to stay anonymous, it seems. I don't know if you can see the questions as well, but this person asked, could you develop on the link between marketization and technology? For instance, the emergence of platform, algorithmic management, etc. So how do you think that both concepts, technological innovation and marketization, could relate to each other?
Yeah, and this is something we talk about in the chapter of the book on live music. So the chapter of the book on live music is focuses quite a lot on sort of platformization in the live music industry, and it sort of talks about attempts to intensify market competition among live musicians through the use of platforms. So if you imagine previously in live music, if you want to sort of hire someone to play at, let's say, your wedding or something like that, you might do it through kind of word of mouth. You might ask someone you know, or ask someone like a friend of a friend. Whereas now what you could do is obviously go to a search engine, Google music for wedding, and you'll be taken to these things which sometimes describe themselves as platforms, where you can kind of browse potentially thousands of live music acts. So we have on one level this process of the use of kind of digital technologies to intensify market competition, because now you have thousands of people, whereas previously you would have just negotiated something directly with someone. Previously, you now have thousands of people all displaying different prices and competing for you to kind of select them on this kind of price comparison website. Now, what we argue there, however, is that to some extent, the story about kind of technologically driven transformation is actually quite limited, because if you look at how these really work, the enterprises using them want to benefit from the ability to kind of use digital technologies to assemble all of these acts in one place. But once you actually get to the stage of booking someone, selecting someone, arranging the transaction, it's kind of taken offline and it's done over phone or email, not over the platform. So what we try and argue in the book is that to some extent, the technology here is subject to the agency of businesses who are trying to extract profit. So Ian and I, you might be aware of a kind of, I guess, sort of skeptical about the sort of grander narrative about platform capitalism and platformization. We argue that actually, in this case, there's partial sort of platformization to some extent, but also it's kept within strict limits and is kind of unsustainable within live music and underwhelming. And the reason for that is because beyond a certain point, human oversight is still needed in order to sort of ensure stable, reliable profit extraction. So, yeah, we try and talk about how technological devices are sort of manipulated and harnessed in pursuit of so that capital can kind of stay in charge of the process of implementing and managing marketization, if that makes sense. So can control the terms of competition, if you like.
Thank you very much, Charles, for your answer. We've got another question from Mathieu. Maybe if you want to open your mic, or should I read it for you?
I've written the question, but I can ask it live.
Go ahead.
So I just wanted to use a quick question on the pandemic. Is state involvement during the COVID-19 pandemic an example of reverse marketization in certain sectors? Because we've seen intervention in healthcare or supply chain about vaccine or drugs, or it was for you a conjunctural accident because of the crisis and it's not permanent, and marketization will be bring back. So that was my question.
This is something that we had to think a lot about as we were finishing our book in the middle of the pandemic. And I mean, the common sense of policymakers is still, I think, skewed towards marketization. Yes, government has to act in a pandemic to make sure that people get vaccines and PPE and that the hospital system does not collapse, that other supplies are provided. But, like, one example that Charles mentions when we're talking about this, and that we mention in our book, is that there's this constant refrain in Britain that the government is just handing out contracts to their friends, and because what they should do is have a transparent price-based competitive procedure. And so so in Britain, in this example, the Labour Party really kind of has market thinking deeply ingrained. And of course, maybe the government is corrupt, and they certainly do seem to be handing out contracts to their friends. But the way that it gets criticized, I think, just reinforces market thinking. I mean, there are lots of other examples where in the pandemic things, we thought we were seeing pandemic-related rollbacks in markets. For example, in like welfare states, they loosened up on job search requirements for people receiving job seeker benefits. But of course, those were just temporary. Or like in German healthcare, I just said that that the government reversed some of the market mechanisms, but that took place in part during the pandemic, but it sort of predates the pandemic. It was caused by other things other than the pandemic. So, we don't think the pandemic will have a lasting effect on whether market mechanisms are used by governments or companies.
Still, we'll see in the future. There is nothing harder to sorry, I've got it in French, not in English. I will think of it and share my thoughts later on. Maybe it's time to ask Gregor, to let Gregor ask his question. Because he should have had time to prepare it. Gregor?
This is a great discussion. And thanks so much to everyone. And I speak from a position of pure ignorance at the moment because I haven't read the book. However, I'm a little exasperated because I wonder if noisy politics, after all this work you've done, is your best shot. Philippe highlighted, and I heard that as well from Valeria, a tension between the larger narrative, which I think we can buy into in terms of the impact of social class and class power, and what you're actually seeing on the ground. And because I haven't read the final chapter or the ones preceding it on Beyond Marketization, I wonder what more you have to say about political and industrial and mobilization strategies, because you've looked at this a lot, so it's really interesting. But you'll confess, and you only had 10 minutes at the outset to set this out. It was pretty thin, and probably you were running out of time as well. So and this is a criticism that is made of progressive intellectuals, that we're so much better at illustrating how things are going badly and not setting out strategies that help us to understand how we might reverse these trends, unless you're really telling us that you're temperamentally disinclined to see that counter mobilization, which I don't think is the case.
I mean, I think for us, it's probably quite, I mean, for me, it might be that Ian has a different way of saying this. It's probably quite sort of contingent, actually. The different sectors we look at, how can workers actually effectively mobilize against these things? Well, the answer is probably different in each different case. So if I think about music, for instance, there is solidarity within, among kind of live musicians. There is, in many cases, a sort of collective consciousness, a desire to resist exploitative conditions. It manifests in very, very particular ways, because it's such a particular setting. It manifests in kind of particular discourses that get propagated, which encourage people to sort of fight back against exploitative practices. It manifests in things like kind of informal blacklists and kind of name and shame campaigns against exploitative clients. And it often manifests in kind of conflict between workers themselves, where some live music performers might identify others as essentially undercutting them, and then that leads to kind of discussions within the scene. So there is solidarity there, but it takes a very particular form, quite adapted to sort of conditions in that industry. Likewise, if I think about something like healthcare, where certainly with Jen Collet-Lepalme, she and I looked at kind of trade union mobilization in French healthcare, and we saw, again, very particular strategies, very sort of closely related to the context, which often came down to particular ways of framing disputes, particular ways of kind of framing issues. So if I think about, COVID era protests by French hospital workers, very often this was driven by a sort of conscious decision by French unions to kind of reject the sort of national emergency solidarity kind of narrative that governments were expounding about COVID. We all have to work harder, we all have to make sacrifices to get through this national crisis. And the kind of response from French unions in the healthcare sector was essentially, no, screw you, this is an opportunity to mobilize, to push back on all the things you've been doing to healthcare workers for decades anyway. And so starting to kind of reframe disputes about justice for healthcare workers. So I don't know if this answers your question at all, but I think my answer is, it's actually the way workers mobilize against these things is quite contingent, and there are quite sort of specific strategies that seem to work in different contexts. And I think in some of the other papers, some of the other sort of pieces we've done around this project, we probably put that together in a more sort of piecemeal kind of way. Ian, do you want to add anything?
Very interesting, Charles. I think that's a great response. And then the question is, but I don't want to cut off Ian, of therefore pulling out some of those aspects of that contingency, which has a lot to do with capacity building, thinking about how you build that capacity and use it in those contingent circumstances. That's my takeaway, but I need to look more carefully at what you've done, but the answer is really interesting.
I mean, it's a deliberately it's a deliberately minimalist program, as I said, and we there's making noise and disruption, and that is in some ways a response to what we see a lot of academics saying, which is partnership is needed and unions getting involved in policy-making processes. Well, they also need to disrupt quite often. And sometimes that disruption is noisy and considered counterproductive by elites. And, it emerges from everyday life at work. And so our discussion is really about that. And of course, a lot of the forms of resistance we see are not protests or particularly noisy. Sometimes they're just people in bureaucracies saying, no, this doesn't work, we don't want it, and not complying. So that's kind of, actually, there is a way that workers and managers and people who oppose marketization do intervene in more quiet ways. But yeah, I mean, I think we were responding to a lot of ideas out there. Well, unions should have political concepts and grand plans for fixing things. And we were much more interested in what is coming from the grassroots.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ian, for this thoughts for the future. I think we're running out of time. I don't know why, but each time I moderate a seminar, we're running out of time. Maybe I'm part of the problem, but maybe very quickly, Étienne or Valeria, if you've got a very final word to share with us before we would say goodbye to everyone, and we will thank you. We'll thank Ian and Charles for their fantastic book, and I will thank you first for your fantastic comments. It's been a great session. So maybe Étienne.
Well, I'd like to thank the authors for allowing me to read a very challenging book. I've been trained in political economy, but been you raised some authors like Hilferding that I had not read for decades. And it was exciting to see your conceptual apparatus being carefully developed in the first part and rigorously applied the second. And I was really excited by the whole project, including reading on the sides what you've done on other case studies, like the book on employment services or articles, etc. So I think this is a great research project overall, and I encourage you to push it forward, and I'll be looking forward to reading new stuff coming out of that research. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Étienne. Valeria, any concluding word?
Well, I just want to once more congratulate Ian and Charles for having, kind of given to us this book that we can use. And I think I will use it for sure. It made me really thinking a lot. And I think there is a lot of, interesting material in this book and overall the work you have done. So, I think now is the time for scholars to use it, and for you to go ahead with your research. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Thank you very much, Étienne, and you too, Charles and Ian. And thank you, everybody, for attending the seminar. So we hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I hope we'll have the opportunity to meet in the close future.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks
so much.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
À bientôt. Bye-bye.
À bientôt.
Bye.